Hello, this is Richard Thornton. This is one of the most interesting museum jobs in my entire career. Shortly after completing work on the Trail of Tears Memorial in Council Oak Park in Tulsa, Oklahoma, I was approached by the officials of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation in Shawnee, Oklahoma, to build models that demonstrated the true cultural history of their tribe. Okay, gotta be honest. Not only did I know absolutely nothing about the Potawatomi, I didn't even know how to spell the tribe's name. So I was starting at base one, but had no prejudices. What the officials of the Cultural Heritage Center wanted was an accurate story of the lifestyle of the Potawatomi before contact with Europeans, and then afterwards, when they were cast asunder and scattered around the Midwest at various locations as they quickly tried to absorb European technology. The story of the original Potawatomi was made even more complicated because they migrated throughout the year during the 4 seasons, hence the name of this video. Each season, their lifestyle changed completely. Let's get back and tell you more about the Potawatomi, because I have a feeling that many of you are just like I was when I first started learning about the Potawatomi and was given a stack of books to read by the museum. For untold generations, the ancestors of the Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Ottawa lived on the Atlantic coast of what is now New England and Nova Scotia. The Micmac were their brothers. At that time, they buried their dead in mounds and lived mainly off seafood. I strongly suspect that they are the Skraelings as described by the early Viking explorers of the New World. Because in their own legends, invaders arrived from the sea, which forced them to migrate westward after receiving a prophecy that they would not survive unless they moved westward. As the tribe gradually migrated westward along the edge of Lake Erie, it eventually broke up into 3 bands, which eventually became distinct tribes. The 3 tribes still share many similar cultural traditions and languages. Although they never lived in permanent villages until the early 1800s, the 3 sister tribes had very rich cultural traditions. Still today, their beadwork and paintings are some of the finest in the Native American world. The Ojibwe and the Potawatomi had a writing system which was preserved on bark or deerskin scrolls. Unfortunately, very little of this survives as a result. The original syllabary was in use several centuries ago. Yes, I'm telling you that these 3 tribes had a writing system before the arrival of the English and the French. It's just been something that's left out of the American history books. In the 1700s, French priests developed the original glyphs into a writing system that could communicate complete sentences. The 3 tribes remember the appearance about 500 years ago of 8 prophets carrying scrolls which accurately predict the future. This legend is called the Prophecies of 7 Fires. Now, the version of this story today among the Potawatomi is that the prophecies occurred separately. The legend varies between the divisions of the tribe, but what they now say is that a prophet appeared at each stage of the tribe's life, telling them what the future would hold to prepare them for the future. During this era, the Potawatomi were probably living on some islands which are now Montreal. They next moved to the region around Niagara Falls, where Niagara River connects Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. They next moved to the banks of the Detroit River, where Lake Huron drains into Lake Erie. During the mid-17th century, the Potawatomi lived in the region between present-day Chicago and Racine, Wisconsin. It is not clear whether Les Chicagou, which is the tribe you see in the lower part of this old map, was the division of the Potawatomis or not. It probably was, because Nation of Fire, Nation de Feu, as you see on the center left, is another name for the Potawatomi. The northern boundary was the Racine River. By 1688, the Potawatomi had moved to the northwest shores of Lake Michigan. The French version of their name is underlined in red here. These are not quite accurate maps of the Great Lakes, but it is a map from 1688. It also says that one division of the Potawatomi was called the Michigan, hence the source of Lake Michigan, or the Michigami. So evidently they were a division of the Potawatomi at one time, or maybe they always were a division of the Potawatomi. We're not quite sure. The world of the Potawatomi people was torn asunder when the French and Indian War broke out in 1755. Within 85 years, most surviving Potawatomi people would be living west of the Mississippi River. The Potawatomi remained loyal to the French because of the past protection from tribes allied with the English. Potawatomi men volunteered to fight with French armies against the Redcoats. Other men stayed at home to protect their people from attacks by war parties allied with the English. The wars would continue for 60 years, but unfortunately, the Potawatomi pitched the wrong side. This would not be the first time that happened. The French lost. The Potawatomi paid a dear price for their loyalty to the French. They were initially considered hostiles by the English and lost much of their original land. This led to a series of wars. Again, in the American Revolution, the Potawatomi sided with the British, which initially brought them success in the opening battles with the American patriots. But as the Patriot Army became more and more skilled and better organized, the Potawatomi lost. So by the end of the war, the Potawatomi were on the losing side again. They had looked to the British to protect their interests. The British cast them aside. They did not protect their allies. This led to another series of wars in the 1780s up until the 1790s. Again, initially, the allied Midwestern tribes were quite successful. Probably the worst defeat ever in the history of the U.S. Army occurred at the Battle of the Wabash River, November 4th, 1791, in which most of the soldiers and almost all of the camp followers were killed. The Potawatomi were a major element of this battle. But losing again, be on the losing side, meant the Potawatomi would be scattered. Individual bands of the Potawatomi moved throughout the region around the Great Lakes. They kept their knowledge of their cultural past, but in time, because of the lack of communication, they began to have separate identities. Still Potawatomi, but separate tribes. Many of them eventually, due to the Indian Removal Act of 1830, were pushed to Kansas. Yes, that's right. At one time, Kansas was part of the Indian Territory. Here they stayed for a while, but then later most were moved southward into the portion of the Indian Territory that is now Oklahoma. This is where the Potawatomi were given a reservation in 1867, taken from tribal lands of the Choctaw, I believe, looking at the map, after the Civil War, that they jointly shared with the Shawnee. That is the reason why the tribal headquarters is in Shawnee, Oklahoma. The citizen band, though, was not fully recognized until 1938 as part of the American Indian Reorganization Act. How do you recreate the lost worlds of the Potawatomi? What we decided on in dealing with the staff of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation Cultural Heritage Center was one model that would actually be 4 models. We had each season as a separate scene blended together with the other, which is also tied in with the religious and cultural symbolism maintained through the centuries by the Potawatomi. So it was a natural, the 4 seasons. Here you see the model on display now in the museum. under a glass case. It's part of a total exhibit where the public is introduced to the true history of the Potawatomi people. It's very interesting. There were sophisticated people, just as they are today. They're known as outstanding artists and musicians. Very intelligent. They stress education in the raising of their children, and this education shows itself in the very sophisticated exhibits in the museum. Where do one start if one is an architect, though? Well, we start with the base, and it has to be absolutely perfect. Here you see the work that was about a week's work is involved to make a perfectly flat, square base for the museum exhibit. In the background, you see my three pups, who very shortly after this model was built would find themselves living in a tent with me in the Smoky Mountains, only about 3 months later. And this is another interesting story about the model. I thought I was going to close on a mitigation loan in mid-January with Fannie Mae. Someone either intentionally or accidentally screwed up, and sheriff's deputies showed up at my home on December 21st at 8:23 p.m. telling me 8 a.m. Telling me that I had to be out of my home in 3 days on Christmas Eve. Originally, the Potawatomis planned to pick up their model after Christmas, but praise the Lord, they came before Christmas. So the finished model got out of the house, out of my model building lab before I had to completely depart my home and never see it again. But these are the famous three dogs that accompanied me on a 2-year journey through the Appalachian Mountains. This is my former home in Jasper, Georgia. The first step after building the base were the two individual models. On the left is the scenario for a 4-season model, and on the right is the Wabash River, which was the location of a town that looked not a whole lot different than the towns lived by white settlers in Indiana. Here you see the models are beginning development. In the background you can see the walls of my model studio. As the scenes develop, they start coming to life. Fortunately, in the southern Appalachians, we have several plants that are absolutely perfect for model building, for displaying shrubbery and trees. Most of these trees and bushes you see came within walking distance of my home, just along the stream bed. It's a wild ancestor of the hydrangea, for those of you familiar plants that grow in the southeast, but this is the wild hydrangea. At various stages to the project, since we were separated by about 800 miles, I would take photographs of the model and then put notes on them, which I would send to the museum staff, and they would make any changes at that time before I got too far along with the display. As you imagine, there's a lot of work involved in building a model. But here you see the concept of the spring, on the left, the spring village, on the right, the crops, the gardens of the summer, then the lake where there would be large fields of wild rice, the fall time scenery, the changing scenery of summer, and finally in the upper left-hand corner, the hill country where they spent their winters. Here's a close-up of the encampment for the winter in the hill country. In the foreground on the right, you will see a bear invading the village and two hippopotami in bearskin attacking the bear to keep him away from the villagers. Here's another view on the left of the village, and on the right is late winter time, a Potawatomi woman boiling down maple sap in order to make maple syrup and maple sugar. Yes, the Potawatomi did this long before the French and English arrived. The spring village by the river, where the fish swim upstream. They would go to the shallows beneath a waterfall and set up a village, which often served as their semi-permanent village for the year. And here they would catch fish, and they would harpoon fish. And on the right, you see a fish trap and a fish dam next to the garden. This is also typically in spring when marriages were held, when announcement engagements were held, in which court cases were held before the leadership of the tribe. On the far left, you can see a leader in his throne of logs hearing two plaintiffs who have a complaint before the tribal government. We think that the Potawatomi villages were never very large during this period because they lived off the land, and if they had too many people living at one place, there'd be too many mouths to feed for the resources available. This is probably the reason that they scattered into so many different distinct bands as a response to the invasion of the American settlers. Another view of the settlement during the summer. You see the fish trap, a man spearing fish in two places. Again, a close view of their houses, the wigwams, the shelters, the typical appearance of a village at that time. Summer village, pretty much the same, but perhaps in a location where the river was wider and there was bottomlands for growing corn, beans, and squash. Yes, they were farmers, but agriculture was just part of the way that they fed themselves. It was a seasonal thing. Their cornfields were not nearly as large as those in the South and the lower Mississippi Valley. In the autumn, they would depart the large villages and move to campsites where only families or extended families were living. These were located near the stands of wild rice on the edge of the lake. Here, they would go out in canoes and beat the stalks of wild rice, causing the seeds, the rice heads, to fall into the coup, and then they would be hauled back to their campsites for drying, processing, and storage. Here's another view. In the foreground, you can see the way that the Potawatomi built a birch bark canoe. We mentioned the prophets. There's several different versions of the story. This is how I displayed it in the model. Here there are 7 prophets standing around the fire, and these are called the prophecies of the fire. So you notice that each one is holding a scroll. The legend is so strong among the 3 sister tribes, I have no doubt that it's absolutely true. The details might be slightly different, or it might be a mixture of all the stories, but I have no doubts that they did receive these prophecies because they had such an enormous cultural impact for many centuries on the 3 tribes of the fire. Well, after the American Revolution, the Potawatomi were under extensive pressure from the governor George Washington to assimilate and adapt the technology of Europeans and live like white men, and this they did. Let's make this clear. They did not refuse to civilize. They did what they were told to do and did it quite well. In this picture on the left, you see a white man who went into their communities and sketched them as they were assimilating into the European culture of America in the federal period. This is a large Potawatomi town on the Wabash River. It's a very elaborate model, as you can imagine. Look at the detail I put into it to get the crops, the feeling of taking swampland and turning it into cultivated land. But this actually occurred. You can see along the right side of the river where the swamps are being drained and they've been replaced by vegetable gardens and cornfields. On the left, you see log cabins, log houses, very little different than what was being built by white men at that time, except they typically did not build stone chimneys. This was an exception to the rule. But on the other hand, many white settlers only had log cabins, and log chimneys also. In the center, you will see a fish trap. We know for a fact that the Potawatomis continued to trap fish in their traditional ways, even after they adapted to raising livestock and growing crops year-round. Here's another view of the same model. Give you a better feeling what the town looked like. This is based on actual drawings by the white man I showed in the original part of this section. So these are fairly accurate description of the structures in the Potawatomi town of Wabash. This is one of the nicer houses, a two-story log house, which really was no different than what one would have found in eastern Ohio or western Virginia at this time on the frontier. Uh, Reminds me of several houses that date from the early 1800s that I worked on in the Shenandoah Valley as an architect. There was a Roman Catholic chapel in this particular thing. This is one of the towns that became the ancestors of the citizen Potawatomi tribe, by the way. So there was a chapel, there was a cemetery here for the Christian Indians, and clustered around it were houses of various sizes, depending on the individual wealth of the families. Livestock during this period was allowed to wander through the Potawatomi towns. You see goats, sheep, and cattle, and horses and donkeys wandering all through the landscape of the community. That was something that was commonplace with Potawatomi that might not have been accepted as well by white settlers. But there were many different lifestyles in this community. This is one thing that was stressed to me by these staff in the museum. Even though, yes, there was a core group of Potawatomi who were learning to read and write, who were actively Christian, mostly either Roman Catholic or Methodist at this time, yet away from these towns were Potawatomis living very different lifestyles. On the foreground on the left, you see a farm that's detached. It's meant to symbolize a farm that's detached and living in the hill country or the short mountains of certain part of Indiana, where they had alpine pastures and mainly raised cattle. On the right, we have traditionalists living in a wigwam. They're just outside of town, but they refuse to live in log cabins. But they do have a garden. They do have some livestock, as you see. But in addition to the traditionalists that you see again on the upper right-hand corner, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of homeless Potawatomi roaming the Midwest at the time who were given land by the federal government or by the Canadian government and then driven off by white settlers at gunpoint. And they wandered about the landscape looking for a place to live, often only living in crude shelters like in the foreground. These people had a very high death rate from disease, and you can see a Potawatomi funeral from that time immediately above the shelter, where people are circled around the grave and there's a Potawatomi blanket on top of the grave. Today, the Potawatomi people of Oklahoma are known as being highly intelligent, well educated, extremely talented in many fields of the arts, and very much assimilated into the community. They're very proud of their Potawatomi heritage, but they also are citizens of the community in which they live and the state in which they live, and contribute greatly to the progress of Oklahoma. And for this, they can be proud. It's an ancient, great nation that has a proud past, but always has a very bright future. Thank you for joining us.